Yeah. Hello, college football fans. Sometimes I sort of feel like we need like a catchphrase at the beginning of the show, something to, I don't know, maybe. I guess that's still a little bit of a work in progress. Anyway, I'm glad to have you here for DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. I'm going to confess something at some point in time today. I'm starting to make peace a little bit with some of this craziness that's going on around the SEC, even if I don't love it. Like, what's the Stanley Kubrick thing about, how I learned to live with it or something along those lines? I mean, at some point in time, you just sort of got to embrace it and go with it. And I guess that's the stage of all of this we're in when it comes to soon-to-be SEC expansion and then whatever the heck is coming after that. So we'll talk about that some on the show. I am going to continue today something we also talked about yesterday, which is big year coming up for Georgia. Tough to do everything that Dog fans want them to do, but at least your coach is saying all the right things going into the start of this upcoming year. I'll give you another significant example about that on today's show. Our buddy Mike Griffith stops by. Who knows what that leads to? I've got what I think is a fairly provocative question to ask of and about Nick Saban before we're done on today's show. So it's going to be a pretty interesting day, I think. A lot of fun, as per usual. Hopefully, at least you see it that way. Really glad you're here. And by the way, it all leads up to SEC Country Live this afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern Time as well, on the SEC Country video channels. So all your stuff right here for you in one spot. Glad to have you with us. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Harris Cherokee Resort. Find us online at Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I want to pick up today where we kind of left off yesterday, at least in one regard. We are in talking season, right? And talking season's almost over now, by the way. We're about to have practice for the Dogs at some point in time next week, and the season is really here at that point. I actually like the off season because I like summer. I like being at the pool, although it's rained a bunch this year. I like all the things that go along with summer. Others of you feel a little bit different. Some of you just want to hit that fast forward button and get to the start of the season as quickly as you possibly can. I understand those of you that do feel that way. And if you're one of those people, you should know that it's essentially here. Like, the season is upon us. Practice is about to begin. Real practice updates, real, daily progress towards that season opener against Clemson. That is on its way, and we're kind of in that midst right now, which is a fun thing to consider. But to the extent that we still are in that portion of the football calendar known as the talking season, when blowhards like me speaking to a microphone make our preseason predictions, and coaches are asked questions and kind of forced to give their assessment of the situation right now, really the only thing you can hope from your coach during talking season is he kind of says the right things, as you would determine them, as someone like me might determine them. It's kind of hard to win talking season. I think you can lose it, if you're denying the expectations that exist for your program, or if you seemingly have the wrong idea in mind for what leads to the kind of success you want to have. I think you can lose talking season. I don't know that you can actually win it, because sometimes to have one talking season leads to the kind of disappointment that follows that sometimes on the field. We've seen examples of that maybe around the SEC. But as I said before, the good news related to all of this is understanding what awaits Georgia this year, the kind of year where, as I said on Monday's show, you've got to sort of do something that's a little bit unexpected. Georgia's expected to win the SEC East. That's no longer good enough for some fans. Georgia's expected to finish just behind Alabama in the SEC. Georgia fans want more than that. Understanding all of that, you've got to do something unexpected this year. You've got to have individual players who outpace their preseason projection. You've got to have enough of those guys add together so that Georgia as a team can outpace what the media thinks is possible for it right now. Best in the SEC East, second best in the SEC. If that works out that way, maybe possibly on the outside looking in for the college football playoff. You've got to do something unexpected to confound those predictions. And as we've said, if Georgia's going to travel that kind of path this year, there are really two twin pillars that help get that done for you. On the one side of the ball offensively, You got to have more explosive plays. You got to just be the kind of explosive offense that fills up not just the stat sheet, but the highlight reel, right? You've got to have good-looking, pretty ball plays taking place during the game, and if you can do that, you could be well on your way. And yesterday, I played an audio clip for you that I liked from Kirby Smart, because in that clip, one of the things that Smart talked about was, hey, we like what JT Daniels brings to the table. We like his arm talent. We think he's championship caliber and all the things that Smart kind of said about JT Daniels. And in the same breath, Smart said, and we've also got to cultivate playmakers. So that's one of the things that Alabama had in 2020 and LSU had in 2019. You had these playmakers that also made the job of the quarterback a little bit easy. Sometimes the quarterback makes the playmaker's job easy, and sometimes the playmaker makes the quarterback's job easy. But either way, in addition to high-quality quarterback play, you got to have those big-time playmakers. And when I hear Kirby Smart say something like that at SEC Media Days, to me, that sounds pretty good. That sounds like at least a step in the direction of talking about putting the spotlight where it needs to be, cultivating those playmakers in offense, which is a really good thing. Now, that was yesterday. Here's today, and it's a similar type of thought process, line of commentary, but it comes on the defensive side of the ball instead of the offensive side of the ball. And our buddy Mike Griffith, who will join us later on, wrote about this for DawgNation.com. That's how I actually first became aware of it, so I'll give a shout-out to Mike, and we'll talk to him more about this in a moment. Mike linked to an interview that Kirby did with, that streaming thing that CBS does, like the CBS Sports HQ or whatever it's called. So Smart does an interview with CBS during SEC Media Days, and the subject of defense comes up. And there's all this chatter about replacing, guys like Eric Stokes or Tyson Campbell from the defensive secondary. Obviously, departures like Richard LeCounte and everything else. But listen to how Kirby Smart, in this clip I'm about to play for you, really zeroes in on what he thinks may be the most important name of all to replace. And this just makes so much sense, and to me, this is exactly where, if I'm a Georgia fan who wants Georgia to build off what it did a year ago, the way in which Smart describes the need to replace Azeez Ojulari here, to me indicates that Smart's line of thought about his defense going into the start of practice, leading into the start of the upcoming season, it is right where I believe a Georgia fan should want it to be. This is good stuff from Kirby Smart, SEC Media Days with CBS Sports HQ. Here's a brief clip. Take a listen to this.
The Azeez loss is probably more impactful than maybe even the corners. Both corners were drafted before Azeez, but the loss of that pass rush could be critical if we don't find somebody to replace that. We feel like we have some good young secondary players. They got to go play. That's part of this all-season discussion is who's going to be the key factors. We've got some good young players. They got to grow up and play.
So Kirby Smart says, yes, you've heard us talk about secondary before, and that's why I'm obviously paraphrasing, I'm adding to what Smart's saying there, but that's why we brought in Darian Kendrick, and that's why we brought in Tyke Smith, and clearly Eric Stokes and Tyson Campbell and DJ Daniel and guys like that are gone from the program. But as prominent as any of that, maybe even more so, is the need to replace Azeez Ojulari. And I personally believe that's 100% true. That the single most important individual name that must be replaced, whose absence must be accounted for, whose prodigious hole left in the stat sheet because of his departure, the biggest individual name to consider there, I do believe, is Azeez Ojulari. And when I hear Kirby Smart echo what seems to me just an obvious objective truth when looking in at UGA, it makes me feel really good for Georgia's potential ability to actually successfully replace Ojulari this year. And what's even more so is this actually is a continuation of what has been a very consistent line of thought from Kirby Smart throughout the entirety of the offseason. Because much the same way there, speaking to CBS Sports HQ, Smart says, yeah, listen, replacing Azeez Ojulari is going to be a really big deal for us. This is also something that Smart spoke about very, I would say, prolifically back during spring practice. And I'm about to play this clip for you, but let me just say this before I do. Obviously, Smart's a guy that likes to play his cards close to the vest, right? I mean, it's his prerogative not to reveal too much about his innermost thoughts, and sometimes he likes to kind of keep that between the white lines in the practice field, and to a degree, we understand why he'd want to do that, right? So understanding that about Kirby Smart, when Smart goes into detail about something, knowing that sometimes he likes to avoid details, then to me, as a fan of this team, and as someone who tries to narrate the experience of being a fan for you on a show like this, my ears really perk up. That when Smart is more detailed than he needs to be, whatever he is saying must have the ring of actually being important. And when he brings up a name unsolicited, that's also the kind of thing that has extra importance to me there as well. So if you want to go back to spring practice, and on the heels of what we heard Smart say last week about the need to replace Azeez Ojulari, when this topic came up during the spring and a name like Nolan Smith would be the subject of a question, listen to the very detailed answer Smart gives in response to that and the ways in which he shows his personal value of what Ojulari did for Georgia in 2020, which was greatly upgrading the pass rush. This is Kirby Smart from the spring.
I'm looking for everybody on the defense to improve. We have to create pass rush. We have to create havoc. We have to do those same things. I thought last year was probably one of our best years ever in terms of sack production, and Dan has done a good job making that a priority by the way he schemes the defense and the way he calls the defense. And we had productive rushers, but a lot of that was, what he called and trying to scheme to get guys one-on-one. Trevon's the guy that's going to have a big year for us. Not only is he replacing Malik, but in a lot of ways he's replacing Aziz. And I think everybody just assumes with Aziz being gone that it's like Nolan's job. It's not like that for us because 60, 70% of the snaps, Trevon is Aziz and Nolan is Aziz. They're just one's left and one's right. So both those guys play defensive end a lot.
So I think that's really interesting because as we think about guys like Nolan Smith and certainly Adam Anderson as those outside linebackers who provide the replacement for Azeez Ojulari, Kirby Smart back in the spring also mentioned Trayvon Walker there as one of those guys that potentially does that too. But beyond that, there are a couple of other things that I think are really interesting about what Kirby Smart says. I think there's this thought sometimes that old school coaches might have had along the lines of, I don't care how we win the games just as long as we win them. But I think in modern times we know that the way in which you go about building your program makes wins either more likely, especially in big games. And Kirby Smart uses a couple of key buzz phrases there. We have to create pass rush. We have to create havoc. The best teams do that, right? I mean, you can be 9-3 and be stingy on defense and kind of careful and be gap sound and keep contained and things like that. But the very best teams are also going to be aggressive defensively. That's what we see national champions doing. It's nice to hear Kirby Smart acknowledging that. And the other thing that Kirby Smart says here, and I want to spend just a couple of seconds on this, is that, and I think maybe the average fan doesn't quite realize just how true this is. He talks about how Georgia took a big step forward last year when it comes to its overall pass rush. And I think one of the things that obscures that was last year was a shorter season. So in some cases, stats, I'm not saying they mean less last year than they normally do, but they're maybe a little bit more difficult to process because we're used to seeing stats look a certain way on the basis of a 12, 13, 14 game season, whatever else. So here's what I've done for you. I've gone back and looked at the 5 previous years of Kirby Smart at Georgia, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And I've tried to demonstrate sacks on the basis of the average number of sacks that Georgia has gotten per game. Let me show you this on the screen here. Kirby Smart says last year was our best year in pass rush. And the stats show just how true that really is. Go back to Smart's first year in 2016, Georgia averaged 2.23 sacks per game. In 2017, a year in which Georgia played in the national championship, played in 15 total games, and had the best, up until, last year, the best, sack performance of the Kirby Smart era, still only averaged 2.26 sacks per game over the course of that span. 2018, the numbers dipped even more, down to just 1.71 sacks per game. It was a good defense for Georgia in 2018, but only averaged 1.71 sacks per game. It's one of the reasons why before the start of the 2019 season, you heard so much during that spring practice about havoc rate and being more aggressive in the backfield. Georgia was in 2019, at least in comparison to 2018, but still only averaging 2.21 sacks per game. Let me show folks once again on the screen what happened in 2020. It's amazing on the basis of a per-game average how much better Georgia was in 2020. Georgia averaged 3.2 sacks per game a year ago. That's almost a full, it really basically is a full sack per game better than any other year under Kirby Smart, just slightly less than a full sack, but essentially a full sack per game better a year ago than it had been in any other year in the Kirby Smart era dating back to 2016. That's how much better Georgia was with its pass rush a season ago. And obviously Azeez Ojulari is a big part of that. He had 8.5 sacks in 2020. That's more than any individual performer in the Kirby Smart era. So two things are true here. Georgia became way better at its pass rush last year, which is an important piece of information for a team trying to take a step towards a championship. But the guy who is the single most important individual contributor to that is gone. So that sets up for a fascinating stage here in 2021. Georgia knowing what it needs to do. Smart hasn't shied away from saying we've got to continue the pass rush momentum we had in 2020, but still trying to identify the guys who it's going to be. The good news is the candidates for this certainly seem robust. Adam Anderson, a lot to like about him. He's already on NFL draft radars. Nolan Smith, a lot to like about him as well. He's the former #1 recruit in the country. That still matters. Kirby Smart says, don't forget about Trayvon Walker here, there as well, because of the ways he's going to line up, the ways we're going to use him. I think it's really interesting for Georgia this year. The best teams in the country are those teams that create havoc. They sack quarterbacks. They're active in backfields. Georgia last season took a big step towards looking a lot more like that, and it's nice to hear Kirby Smart say they want to continue that trend into 2021 as well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort, and happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today, live on video, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch. Also, we're hearing great feedback about the folks who are watching the show right there at DawgNation.com, right there at the top of the page. When you go to DawgNation.com, a website you're already visiting every day anyway, our show conveniently placed for you right there at the top. No secret about why we're doing this. This is simply based on the fact that Facebook, a tech platform like that, just doesn't quite send notifications to many of you like you wish it still did. That's become a source of frustration. This is our response to that. You don't have to wait for Mark Zuckerberg to tell you we're live. You can just simply go to DawgNation.com and see us right there. Also, more fun and surprises coming related to this in the days to come. And a big thanks to our friends at Harris Cherokee Casino Resort for making it all possible. You know, it's a 2-hour drive from Atlanta, whether you're talking about the original Harris Cherokee Casino Resort property or Harris Cherokee Valley River. I'm talking about casino gaming, the beautiful mountains of western North Carolina, which is so much fun. Also, gourmet restaurants, which are a real treat and a great getaway, good food, a part of any kind of experience like that. Harris Cherokee Casino Resort obviously provides that for you. Harris Cherokee Valley River there as well. World-class shopping, luxurious, relaxing spa, entertainment returning to Harris Cherokee Casino Resort there as well. And, of course, the sports book is now open, too. You can place your wagers on sports right there at Harris Cherokee Casino Resort or Harris Cherokee Valley River. Really fun stuff all the way around there. Just go to Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee to find out more about that. That's Caesars.com/Harris-Cherokee. You can find out about all kinds of really fun things going on at Harris Cherokee Casino Resort and Harris Cherokee Valley River. All right, we'll have, as I promised, Mike Griffith here coming up in just a couple of moments. Before that, I want to go around the doghouse. And let me say this here really briefly before we kind of, move on with the rest of this. So I've talked before about the fact that, I am by nature a traditionalist, especially when it comes to college football, because college football, in addition to being my life's work, is also my #1 pastime there as well. So many of you have connected with me because we all just love college football so much. And so I'm always really nervous when the sport has the potential of great change, because you're always afraid that the great change that might take place is kind of one of those things that might impact and make the sport that you've loved less than it once was. And I'm not, immune to that. I think about those kinds of things all the time. But there's also this parallel to that, this need to just kind of roll with the punches, whatever they may be. So latest example of that is with the very now likely could come maybe as soon as this week, maybe even. Certainly Texas and Oklahoma are on their way out of the Big 12, and the official announcement from the SEC expected sooner rather than later. And this is one of those weird things. It doesn't seem great for college football. I'm not even sure it's great for the SEC, even though it's lucrative and even though it makes the SEC bigger. Sometimes bigger is not necessarily better. I've been a little bit concerned about that. A lot of you have echoed the same kind of sentiment. But at a certain point, you just sort of have to make your peace with it and move on. And now I'm to the point where I can actually officially do that. It's going to happen. It's going to be weird. We'll see if it's better. But unless you want to get run over by the train, you have to sort of stand aside and wave at it as it goes by here. So that's what we'll do related to Oklahoma and Texas now joining the SEC, and we'll just kind of buckle our seatbelts and get on the ride and take this thing wherever it goes from here. That's just kind of the way that it is. So as far as the latest news on this, Sports Illustrated had some reporting on this. The Athletic has had some reporting on this there as well. In fact, let me give you a tweet here from Nicole Auerbach, one of the reporters for The Athletic, in regards to the next domino that's likely to fall, or could fall, maybe a better way to say this, related to Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. Nicole writes on Twitter and teases her story by saying that a lot of us hope that the 12-team college football playoff would begin soon, as early as 2023. But the SEC, Oklahoma, Texas, merger here might delay that timeline, she says. Multiple sources believe there will be those involved in the process who want to wait to assess the fallout from this round of realignment. So, in other words, we've said before that one of the things that potentially aided the SEC in adding Texas and Oklahoma was the expanded playoff, because all of a sudden now you didn't have to worry about, well, if I come into this deep of a league and there's only one playoff spot to go around, are we hurting our team? For instance, Oklahoma, which has used the pillow soft Big 12 as a springboard to the college football playoff many times, it might be a little bit of a turnoff to think about the SEC and a tougher path to playoff. But if there's a 12-team playoff, there's a lot less to worry about when it comes to that. But Nicole saying here, and Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated has reported something similar, that especially out west, there could be a little bit of a, well, hold on, we weren't really consulted too much on this process. In fact, David Shaw, the Stanford coach, has said something about that, pretty explicitly at Pac-12 Media Days yesterday of, maybe we should make sure this 12-team playoff is something we really want to do here, almost as a way of punishing the SEC for, at least that's the read that I get on it, for, kind of playing nice with the 12-team playoff recommendation that a lot of folks were involved with a few weeks ago, while very quietly moving to I guess blow up the sport by adding Texas and Oklahoma here. I mean, here's the weird thing that we're kind of in, though, now when it comes to this. We're almost to the point now where, and you got to be careful, I think, if you're one of these non-SEC entities right now, whether it be a conference, an institution, or whatever else. I mean, as we've said over the last couple of days, is there anything related to college football that would surprise you moving forward? So this notion of, well, we're not going to cooperate with the SEC on a 12-team playoff because they didn't cooperate with us on conference expansion. I mean, you better be careful that the SEC doesn't decide that it doesn't even need the college football playoff anymore. They can just kind of poach the teams, whether it be the best of the ACC, the best of the Big Ten, Notre Dame, whatever else. It just poaches the very best programs in college football, and all of a sudden the college football playoff no longer has a reason to exist because the very best teams competing for a championship are all competing for that championship under the SEC umbrella, or whatever the league decides to call itself when the geographic designation makes even less sense than it does now. So these are weird times. I think the weirdness is apparently only beginning, but you're starting to see maybe a little bit of a act of retribution from the rest of the sport against the SEC, at least when it comes to some saber rattling about the possible slowdown of college football playoff expansion. Ultimately, that probably ends up not being true, but that's at least the line of thought that's out there right now. We'll make that around the doghouse for you here today. And before I talk to my buddy Mike Griffith, let me also shout out some of my other buddies who reach out to me on social media who are enjoying that Finnish long drink. What a great time to be enjoying some of that. Rainy day at the pool yesterday, but you pull some Finnish long drink out of the cooler, and that makes even a rainy day enjoyable because we're talking about a great, easy-to-drink, ready-to-drink beverage. It's a can, looks like a beer, but it's actually not. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail. That means you can pop a top and just drink it straight out of the can, or you can pour it into a glass. My wife actually likes to, kind of put the ice in the glass and pour it in there. She kind of enjoys it that way. Some of you like the long drink cranberry. Some of you like the long drink strong, and let's face it, who wouldn't? A lot of you like the long drink zero. My favorite is actually still the traditional, the original. It's the blue can. It's like a gin and grapefruit mix. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail right out of the can. A lot of you have been trying it. I love to see those pictures of you enjoying it on your vacations and everything you're doing here this summer. If you want to try it for yourself, you haven't yet, if you just go to thelongdrink.com. I was at East Lake Golf Club on Monday. They had it right there at the halfway house. A lot of the golf courses around where I live have got it there as well. It is just a big part of the summer for so many of us. So check it out online, thelongdrink.com, and find out where you can pick up some Finnish long drink here today. All right, before we're done, I've got kind of an interesting question I want to ask about Nick Saban as it relates to SEC expansion. A specific thought that I'm wondering if he's having that's maybe a little bit different than anybody else's potential consideration in all this. So we'll do that here coming up. But for now, on everything happening around Georgia, everything happening around the SEC, the ever-expanding SEC, let's do it all with our buddy Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort. Great to have you with us, everybody.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Great pleasure to speak to Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort. And, Mike, I'm not quite so sure if I'm remembering from Thursday when we did Cover 4 Live. Seems like you weren't maybe super excited about the addition of Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. I'm more of a fan than you are, so I'll speak more candidly about this. I was definitely not excited about it, but as time passes and you realize it's going to happen whether I like it or not, I think at a certain point you have to just sort of make peace with it, buckle your seatbelt, and get on the wild ride wherever it may happen next. Mentally, that's kind of where I am now. It's a completely new normal for college football. I have no idea where it's going from here, but I have to admit I'm pretty fascinated to see how it all plays out. Where's your thought process on it now, having a full week to consider it all?
Well, I mean, they were going somewhere, right? They were going to leave the Big 12. They made up their minds. Obviously, the SEC was the best horse to hitch the wagon to. But if you're the SEC, would you want Texas and Oklahoma going somewhere else and perhaps strengthening the Big 10 or the Pac-12 and maybe then your television contract isn't as big. So with that being the case, it's what is it, Josh Brooks that says change is inevitable, growth is optional. And, the change of Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12 was inevitable, and it was up to the SEC to decide if they were going to be the conference that they grew with. So, that's kind of the way I look at it. If you ask me what I would have preferred, no, I kind of liked it the way it was. I kind of liked the SEC just fine, thank you very much. But, now we're talking about the headache of trying to sort out pods or divisions and, this wish list thinking of Texas and Oklahoma fans that Alabama's going to shift to the east with Georgia and Auburn is just absolutely crazy. But, you got to remember, my concerns are this. These are two schools that have bullied their way through every conference they've been in. We had Barry Trammell on the beat on Monday night, and he pointed that out. And every people that have done their homework know there was a time that Texas and Oklahoma demanded and received a larger revenue share than any of the other schools in the Southwest Conference and in the Big 8. They said, look, we're more important than the rest of you, so we're going to take a bigger cut of the pie. Obviously, that's not good for equality. That's not good for parity. That's not good for fairness. But they are so popular that they demanded it. In fact, I read somewhere where Oklahoma and Texas together have a market value that's greater than the other 8 teams in the Big 12 combined. So my concern now is, will these schools bully the SEC? Will they come in and get their way? And the first thing we're going to see that reflected in is how they divide up these pods or divisions.
So tell me more about your thought on this. You say that it's absolutely crazy that Alabama and Auburn moved the SECs. Why is that?
Because you got to maintain some semblance of balance in the league. I mean, and if you put Alabama and Auburn in the East with Georgia and Florida, you've got arguably 4 of the top 5 programs right there. And that's not fair to anyone. I think it'd be much easier to move Auburn to the East. It's in the past when the SEC's made changes, and we know this because they've asked Georgia to be the ones to bend over and accommodate them. Georgia, can you play Auburn 2 years in a row just so everybody else has it easier? Sure, we'll do that. Okay, well, that needs to stop, number one. Georgia doesn't need to be making any more sacrifices for the league. Still waiting for that to pay off. Certainly didn't pay off with last year's schedule or the year before when they had 5 teams have a bye before they played them. So I've got a problem with that. But, it's a simple fix. You move Auburn to the East, which they should have already been done. Auburn and Alabama become annual opponents. Georgia's going to play Auburn every year anyway if they're in the East. And Georgia picks up Oklahoma and Tennessee picks up Texas. Everybody's happy.
So it's not necessarily that important, but do you not think that a Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Florida East, and a Texas A&M, LSU, Oklahoma, I guess say Texas the 4th, does that not seem fairly balanced?
No.
I mean,
no, doesn't seem fair. Doesn't seem fair to me. I'm not.
Where is the imbalance there? Where's the imbalance there?
Well, I think over the course of time, I think Florida's been better than LSU. If we want to go back to 1990, I think Florida's better than LSU. I think Alabama is better than any of those teams.
Well, I don't want to go back to the 1990s. That was 30 years ago. But
I think you need to if you're going to do an analysis. Anytime you do an analysis, Brandon, you don't just look back 1 year. You've got to look back over at least a 5 or a 10-year cycle. And
let's look back 20 years. Let's look back 20 years. Has Florida been a better
program?
program?
I still think Florida's better. I still think Florida's better. Florida's better, in my opinion. Florida's better than LSU. Auburn's better than Texas A&M. Georgia's better than Oklahoma, and Alabama's better than Texas.
Well, okay, there you go. Do you think divisions is the way they'll go instead of the people talk about pods, or some people talk about like 4-team divisions. Do you still think a 2-division split's ultimately what the SEC will do?
Well, what I think they'll do and what I would do may be two different things. I would stick with divisions because I like it that games in November matter in the race to make the SEC championship game, presuming there'll still be an SEC championship game with 16 teams. I would hope there would still be an SEC championship game, although once we start talking about a 12-team playoff, that might be a little tough. There's been some speculation that there won't be any divisions, and I certainly don't like that concept. I suppose what that does is tries to ensure that the 2 top team plays without regard to division. But, with 16 teams, everybody's not going to play everybody. I mean, there's a lot of unintended consequences to this, even if you go with pods. I would stick with divisions. I tend to think that Greg Sankey, based on his previous actions over the last, I guess since he's been the commissioner in, 2013, is he's tried he's had a defender strategy. He's tried to keep everything as close to the same as possible and keep everyone appeased. And I think divisional play would do that. Now, to your point, it does get sticky when you start talking about leaving Alabama in the West. And I do think your point is fair to wonder, could the SEC have already made a concession with Texas and Oklahoma that they would move Alabama out of the division if they joined? It's quite possible. Those schools are very effective at negotiating and getting their way. I mean, Joe Castiglione orchestrated keeping Georgia out of the playoffs in 2018 so Oklahoma could get in. It wouldn't be a stretch to suggest that there could have been some behind-the-doors negotiations because the transparency is gone. To me, the SEC has lost my trust. For the most part, Greg Sankey has been a pretty stand-up guy who's been pretty transparent and upfront with most every act. But this was a backdoor deal, and I'm pissed off. It's wrong. They didn't tell anybody they were doing this. They announced it. They moved faster than anybody could react. It wasn't in the best interest of the fans. It's a money grab, and I'm disappointed.
Let me ask you this. What's been amazing to me, Mike, is how quickly so much of this discussion, even though I think the Texas and Oklahoma news is just staggering news, and it's taken me a few days to even kind of process it, how quickly so many other media voices have kind of moved on to the next thing. The idea that the SEC is going to add, other big-name teams at some point in time as well, which is totally all speculation right now. But it's fairly recognizable names and respectable voices who are making this speculation. What do you think about the possibility that Texas and Oklahoma is just the start of, for lack of a better phrase, what almost looks like an SEC takeover of the entirety of the sport?
Well, first of all, kudos to you for calling this the story of the offseason. I disagreed last week, but you were right, Brandon. It's the tip of the iceberg of the biggest change in college football. You sniffed that out quickly, faster than most anyone else in the media that I was listening to. Now, that said, some of these voices you're talking to were some of the same voices that were telling us there wasn't going to be college football next season or this season. So I'm not going to jump too quickly on any of those steaming trains downhill. Not to say they're not doing their jobs. I'm sure there's plenty of talk and plenty of speculation, and certainly that fuels interest from fans. I have a real hard time believing. I never say never. I have a real hard time believing, though, the SEC could get bigger than 16 teams unless, as you said before I came on, the SEC just says nuts to you, and we don't need a college football playoff. We're going to create our own league and leave the other sports within the NCAA structure. Now, that concept is interesting, the mini NFL concept, and in fact, that's what they seem to be doing. And I know I said earlier I was quite upset. Probably used a word that's too strong for DawgNation Daily, but they're turning it into the NFL, and I don't want that.
Yeah,
that's not college football. That's not what made it special. They're taking away something that we're all very passionate about, to use another P word, and that we all take a lot of pride in, for another P word, and in sake of a professional sport, for another P word. And I'm not happy. Listen, I want college football. I don't want the NFL. I got the NFL on Sundays, Brandon, and don't get me wrong, I like the NFL, and I like the NFL for being the NFL. But don't let some television executives pull some backdoor deal with the commissioner looking at us one eye and looking out the other eye, cutting these backdoor deals, and Lord only knows how many of these administrators knew about it and didn't share it or blow the whistle. We don't want the NFL on Saturdays. We want college football. And don't tell me this is the only way we can have it, because I don't believe that.
No, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. I mean, it certainly feels less like the sport that I've always loved. I guess I'm just sort of hopeful that it ends up not being as bad as it seems like it could be. Let me shift gears to a different topic while I still have you on the phone here for a moment. One of the things I talked about early in the show, something you also wrote about, whether it's Kirby Smart talking about Azeez Ojulari last week in an interview with CBS, or talking about the need to cultivate playmakers in offense. When it comes to the things that I believe have held Georgia back from winning a national championship, not quite being dynamic enough on defense, although they took a big step in that direction last year in terms of the pass rush, not quite being explosive enough on offense, although there are certainly pieces in place that give you a chance to do that this year. I do like the fact that, at least in my ears, to my mind, Mike, it seems like Kirby's saying the right thing ahead of the start of practice next week and the start of the season a few weeks after that. He certainly seems to be shining the spotlight on where I think it needs to be, finding those guys that can go out and make the explosive plays for you, and finding those guys that can do what Azeez Ojulari did very well last year, which is put quarterbacks on the ground there as well. It's hard to win talking season, but Kirby Smart has said a couple of pretty good things that I think kind of show that the emphasis, at least for right now for Georgia, is where it needs to be.
I would agree. More importantly, there's been action. I mean, it's just Kirby is not going to let anybody get comfortable. He's just not. He's going to talk about people gaining weight or being out of shape, and the players. I guess he's the only one that's allowed to come up with a slogan. The players come up with unfinished business, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to hold you to that. Unfinished business means you better not gain weight or see." He goes after him. I mean, he's just that parental. I mean, we all had that parent that was kind of up our tail on everything, and clean your room and take out the garbage, and Kirby's just relentless, right? And that's the way a football coach is supposed to be, right? He's supposed to keep the guys. He's supposed to keep them motivated. But what's so great about this offseason is the players are self-motivated. JT Daniels and Jordan Davis, and, you see so many leadership figures on the team, and Jamari Salyer, and Zamir White's out there, and Kieris Jacksons, and Nakobe Deans, and there's so many leaders and so many faces and figures that are on a mission, and I like the tone, just like you. I like what I'm hearing from Kirby. Yes, there are plenty of things to address, and I think it's glorious that they opened with Clemson, and Kirby came around and finally said it. Look, this is a great game to open with because you find out where you're at. Number one, it gets your attention the whole off season. If you're thinking about taking a day off, you better know that Clemson's about 65 miles away working on something, so that motivates you. But two, you play that game, and you're going to find out right away what your strengths and weaknesses are. I mean, you go out there and steamroll UAB or Vanderbilt or South Carolina, and you're kind of whistling by the graveyard thinking you're pretty good. I mean, it kind of happened in 2018. Remember that? They go down to LSU and kind of got it handed to them. We thought they were pretly good on the offensive defensive line, and LSU had a little surprise waiting for them. Unplugging the power at their hotel and then taking them down at the stadium. So, this is going to let everybody know where Georgia's at right out of the gate. It's either going to be a momentum boost with a victory. It'll probably launch them to number 1 or number 2 in the Alabama polls over there, or a loss that knocks everybody back a step and says, all right, playoff mentality, got to win the rest of the games, and here's where we got to improve. So I'm with you. I think it's been a really good vibe this off season for Georgia. I haven't seen any Georgia players, really get in trouble off the field. That can sometimes be an indicator that people aren't all bought in when players are getting arrested or doing inappropriate or irresponsible things. I think the one guy with an off-the-field issue transferred to another school. So I think it's been a great off-season.
All right, Mike, good stuff. I look forward to reading a lot more from you as practice kickoff day approaches here at DawgNation.com. We appreciate you being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort today, and we'll look forward to getting a chance to speak to you soon.
Thanks, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So good stuff all the way around there from our buddy Mike Griffith. We got a fun SEC Through coming up there as well. It's also time for me to do something that I've really been enjoying doing this week, which is announcing our Kroger 5-Star Kid winners. This has been so much fun. Great one to give out today. Kaori Howard is the winner of our Kroger 5-Star Kid today. We'll show you some nice pictures of Kaori. 7 years old, entering the second grade. Great thing. Didn't miss a beat last school year, which was a very hard thing for a lot of folks because clearly there were some challenges there. Taking classes virtually, but still excelling. Math and reading skills sharp. Even exceeding those expectations that were there for. So that's great stuff to see. She said, listen to this. This is some organizational skills I need to get a little bit more of. She sets timers for herself so she never missed a class, remained positive throughout the school year, and welcomed all of her classmates with an open heart, which is obviously one of the great things that any young one can do for the other friends in her class. Congratulations, Kaori, our Kroger 5-star kid winner for today. And Kaori gets a great gift card pack that includes $100 to Kroger, $50 to Amazon, $50 to Dick's Sporting Goods, $50 to Domino's. So great stuff there from our friends at Kroger. It's our Kroger 5-star kid winner, Kaori Howard, the winner today. So congratulations, Kaori. Well-deserved there for you. As we roll on here for our SEC through, I want to talk to you about a couple of things here for a moment. So one of the things that we've addressed before is the way in which at one point in time, a robust number of defensive linemen that seem to be in play for Georgia for the class of 2022 has seemingly winnowed just a bit. That list may be a little smaller than it once was. I guess a name that you should at least keep a space in place for is the 4-star Christian Miller, who has put out his top 4 right now, and Georgia has made the list for his finalists. First of all, I think these graphic edits just keep getting better and better. We have this. Can we show that? Oh, do we have Christian Miller here? Maybe we don't. The graphic edits for this just keep getting better and better. Miller's got, maybe we don't have that. Let me see if I can do it by memory. It's Oregon, it's USC, it's Alabama. No, it's Ohio State and Georgia. Oh, there you go. Look at me. Every now and then I can pull off a memory here. So Georgia makes the list with the 2 schools from the Pac-12, Oregon and USC, and Ohio State. I know that Miller took a pretty high-profile visit to Ohio State a few weeks ago. So Georgia in place there on all of that. And we'll see how it goes. I would not say that right now, Georgia, if there's a more exclusive club than a top 4, maybe Georgia's on the outside of that looking in right now. But obviously still here a hat on the table, which is a nice thing to be able to see. And, of course, continuing to look for that news on Travis Shaw, Walter Nolan, who's got a new high school home there in Knoxville, Tennessee. What's the latest news on guys like that as Georgia battles, a whole bunch of schools for Nolan, Clemson, North Carolina for Shaw, maybe even the in-state power North Carolina as much as anything on that. So Georgia defensive line recruiting going to be a hot topic here as we roll on. Alabama got another commit yesterday, this time from an in-state wide receiver, Kobe Prentice, who looks like a pretty good prospect all the way around. Prentice, though, is a 3-star, which just goes to show you that, sometimes even a program like Alabama occasionally takes the 3-star that even when you're recruiting 85% 4- and 5-star players, there's still the 3-star guy that occasionally gets identified. Georgia identifies some of its own. Alabama, in this case, identifying Prentice, thinking that's a guy they want to make a part of their 2022 class. By the way, speaking of Alabama and Nick Saban, I thought it was interesting that Saban has kind of spoken about, what he expects to happen when it comes to expansion and kind of ready to welcome that. He and Alabama basketball coach Nate Oates kind of both, kind of giving their statements on that. But I was thinking about Saban in particular related to one thing, because I would say that if he was ever going to be totally candid about his feelings on expansion, Saban's opinion on this might be as interesting as anyone. Because here's the thing we know. Saban is a tenacious competitor. And listen, I like taking jabs at Saban. I like picking at the Alabama fans. I've been very candid about this before. There's nothing I love more than picking against Alabama and having that turn out to be true. Picking Auburn to win the SEC West in 2017, picking LSU to do that in 2019, that when you have a chance to pick against Alabama and it works out, you just feel really smart for doing so, because it's just kind of boring with Alabama all the way to the top. I've been very, very honest about that. However, even with all that said, I'll give Nick Saban and Alabama credit, Saban in particular, for the way in which he's maintained that program, even as he approaches now 70 years of age. But one way or another, no matter how tenacious his competitive fire remains, and no matter how focused and driven he remains, he is obviously a lot closer to the end of his career than he was to the beginning. I am curious to see, for a guy that I assume at some point in time will say that he's ready to move on, how the new SEC changes all that for him. There's all of a sudden a guy that, has clearly been driven to win additional national championships, the way that he overhauled his staff after the 2018 loss to Clemson kind of proves this. A guy that's been so driven in all of this, does all of a sudden the presence of a Texas and Oklahoma and the chance to now win an SEC that includes these 2 additional powers, I wonder if that motivates Nick Saban even more. I wonder if all of a sudden Saban wants to do this even more. And if you want to make this about Georgia for a moment, I think it's actually kind of a cool time to be Kirby Smart. Whereas Nick Saban knows one way or another his career's almost done, whether it's 1 more year, 5 more years, whatever else, he's almost done. Smart is still a very young guy. And Smart's got his entire coaching career still in front of him. Vince Dooley coached at Georgia for 25 years. Smart could have another 2 decades at the helm there at Georgia. And all of a sudden now, as he comes into his own as a coach and as the Georgia program that he leads comes into its own as a program, he's doing so in a way that gives him potentially, if you want to have the most positive spin possible on this SEC expansion, the most positive possible spin is this, that Smart is coming of age as a coach at a time in which winning the SEC will have never been more prestigious than it's about to be. And for Georgia fans who want their program to be the top program in college football, to win the version of the SEC that's about to exist, whether it's at 2022 or starting in 2023 or sometime after that, win that SEC, become the dominant program in that SEC, and there will be no question marks as to who the very top program is in college football. So as luck would have it, as the Alabama program gets ready to sunset a bit with the eventual retirement of Nick Saban, maybe the sun's shining on Georgia at just the right time with the SEC about to provide a springboard for fame and springboard for credentialing and gravitas in a way that even the dominant version of this conference of the last couple of years would not have been able to provide. So maybe just kind of something to think about there on that. One more story I want to get to for a moment. And look, this drives me crazy. So David Shaw gets up there at Pac-12 media. It's not media days, by the way. It's just media day. there aren't multiple days with the media out west of the Pac-12. It's just one media day. And I'll read you this tweet. Brady McCullough writes it. So Stanford coach David Shaw was asked about Alabama quarterback Bryce Young making, and I'm going to use air quotes here, although that's not what this reporter does, making nearly $1 million in NIL, according to Nick Saban. David Shaw says, that's not market value. That's Alabama value. Here's my solemn plea to David Shaw. Stop trying to make Alabama sound cool. This is one of those things that, kind of comes across as a little bit of, is this what we want college football to be? But the way in which Shaw says it makes Alabama sound cool, which kind of drives me crazy. And what drives me even more crazy than that, and this is where I'll get on my high horse for a moment. So I read the story at ESPN.com about what David Shaw said. And, there's like I'm not a writer really by trade, but, there's like the whole bottom half of the story is usually kind of catching you up on the backstory for what led David Shaw to say what he said. And in nowhere in that kind of, I guess, bottom half of the story where you're kind of telling the story up until this point, at no point in time does the writer for ESPN point out the fact that Nick Saban was very likely, if not outright lying, at least exaggerating his statement beyond it being true. David Shaw may actually think that Bryce Young, the Alabama quarterback, is making $1 million because that's what it's been reported that it was, even though Dennis Dodd from CBS Sports last week, in the midst of praising Nick Saban for lying about this, admitted that multiple sources told him it probably wasn't true. Yet here we are all these days later, still treating the Bryce Young story as if it was. Is no one under any obligation to actually point out what's actually happening with all of this so that guys like David Shaw aren't this confused about the facts? Apparently I'm the only one that cares about that, but nonetheless, pretty interesting stuff all the way around. David Shaw making Alabama sound like some sort of hero for getting Bryce Young $1 million. I still want to see that tax return before I'm going to believe that's the actual money that Bryce Young's getting. Either way, we'll make that your SEC through. And I want to go back for our Gator Hater roll call today to a spot we were yesterday. Obviously, there is big news in the thrown shoe world when DaBaby, the musical star, was talking about being, had a shoe thrown at him. Marco Wilson actually somewhat, I thought very humorously and in kind of self-deprecating fashion, kind of joked about that on Twitter being the one that threw the shoe. Well, our buddy Forestry Dog, who always sends us tremendous edits through the comment section there, DawgNation.com, has actually taken the DaBaby video and he's actually put the golden shoe on there. This is very clever, very well done. So the actual shoe thrown at DaBaby ends up being the golden shoe, which is, I don't think I ever thought we'd be talking about DaBaby on 2 consecutive shows here on this program, but nonetheless, Forestry Dog, you're our golden shoe winner for today. How about our Gator Hater countdown? 94 days from now, Georgia gets some revenge against Florida. We'll see you tomorrow on DawgNation Daily, presented by Harris Cherokee Casino Resort. and on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. Trust R.S. Andrews to do all that for you. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the prices promised. You can find them online today. They'll get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. We knew this time was coming. It's here. The month of August is going to be blazing hot. We got like 90-plus degree temperatures a lot over the days to come, so it's going to be a scorcher. So go ahead and get your air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs just to make sure that your system can make it through the long days of hot summer that's still on its way. Get the peace of mind you need for that online at rsandrews.com. I started on YouTube yesterday. I'll do Facebook here today. We probably won't go crazy long with the comments, but we will have a good time nonetheless. Let me give my phone a chance to catch up with me on this, and we'll get going here with some pretty good stuff today in the comment section and everything else related to the program today. Your thoughts coming via Facebook. Here we go. On Facebook, Jacob O'Neill says, I'm going to cut it short. Got 10% battery, and I'm uptown. Y'all have a good day. Jacob O'Neill, thanks for being here. Get that battery charged back up. We'll see you again very soon. So, Jacob, appreciate you being here. Let's see what else is going on. Jamie Huff says DeBaby is actually related to Jordan Davis. I did not know that. Maybe everybody did, but I did not know that. That's pretty cool. Philip Jordan Wells says that's a funny edit. Yeah, Forestry Dog is really good. And Forestry Dog, typically only shares his via the comment section there at DawgNation.com. So he kind of has his own way about going about things. But very, very good stuff all the way around. David Harvey says that Shaw was actually kind of, saying bad things about Alabama. That's what he was intended to do, but it kind of comes across as making Alabama sound cool. It's like I think he's trying to say something bad about Alabama, but it comes across as some sort of form of praise. Randy Hall pointing out that Alabama also got Sean Murphy earlier this week. Yeah, we talked about that yesterday. Most of what Bama gets is going to be of the 4- and 5-star stripe, but every now and then, something comes along there. Let's see what else. Jamie Huff says, has Kirby made a comment on Clemson sign stealing? No, we got to ask him about that, though. Our buddy Connor Riley, can you ask at some point in time, will you ask Kirby about sign stealing? Because I probably won't be in the press conferences. But can you ask Kirby about sign stealing? I think he'd give a good answer to that. Because, this is one of those things. This is not like crazy rumor mill stuff like some of the other things that come up from time to time are. This has been openly reported, and a lot of people have had their issues with the Clemson sign stealing thing. I'd just be curious to hear Kirby Smart's thoughts on that. Even if he sidestepped the question, which he obviously would, I'd just be interesting to know, how. I'll say it this way. I think there are some examples from Kirby Smart's past at Georgia that, in addition to sometimes trying to keep the media out and things like that, I think you've seen some examples of Smart taking excessive steps to make sure that information about what's happening with his program, doesn't leak out in any form or fashion. Think about the 2017 national championship game as a for instance on this. Game was a Monday. The Saturday before the game, I think it was Saturday, maybe it was Sunday, Alabama practiced in Atlanta. Most teams practice in the city where the game is played. Georgia went back to Athens to practice. Now, maybe that's just because they were more comfortable in Athens, but they were staying in a hotel. It's not like they were staying in Athens and practicing in Athens. They were staying in Atlanta. They went back to Athens for the practice. There's at least a roundabout way of saying that when you have a chance to control the environment as much as you possibly can, that's what Georgia seems to like to do. Miriam Martin Corbin says, I'm with Mike. No mini NFL. I'm very upset about all of this. And, yeah, I obviously don't like it, but at the same time, I'm to the point now where it's just going to happen, and finding the fun in it, finding the ways in which it might be cool is about the only choice I have left. I think that's actually a fairly good way to say it, is that when you – I'm going to use a bigger word than I should, but part of the reason why the NFL to me is never as much fun as college football is, it's kind of, is it homogenized? I can't even say it, but everything's just sort of the same. And, there's certain teams that do things slightly different. For instance, the Tennessee Titans give the ball to Derrick Henry a lot. The Kansas City Chiefs throw the ball a lot. There's slight differences, but honestly, when you really watch the games, they actually, 32 teams play a fairly similar way. But of the 130 teams that play FBS level football, there's all kinds of different ways in which these teams go about their business, and I do really enjoy that. It's not perfect and pristine the way the NFL is. It's a little bit weird sometimes, and I kind of like that there too. There's a lot of things about college football that just sort of feel gritty and authentic in a way that the NFL just kind of does. And listen, nobody denies the NFL is the biggest sporting entity, certainly in North America, among the biggest in the world. Nobody denies that. But let me tell you the place where sometimes that feels the least true of all. Around 12:58 p.m. inside a stadium right before the game kicks off. Certainly very frequently in Atlanta, the stadium's no more than half full. It's sleepy. It's not an intense environment. Now, 8 gazillion people are watching it on television, but the actual in-stadium atmosphere, and you can say, well, that's because Falcons aren't very good or Atlanta sports fans, whatever else, but I've been to other stadiums there as well, and it was kind of a similar experience too. That, sometimes for as much of a TV product as it is, sometimes the in-stadium experience seems a little lacking in some places, not everywhere, but in some places. And, I think there's a way to measure the intensity of the passion that sometimes to me does feel just more prolific at the college level. Now, it's hard to put a price tag on that, but I do worry that the way in which all of this is going to kind of play out has the eventual risk of making us look back and say, wow, college football used to be really cool, and now it's – I've been trying to formulate my thoughts on this for a column for quite some time. It's not quite working out. To me, it's almost like what the SEC has been is like this sort of like Willie and Waylon authentic coolness, and it runs the risk of becoming sort of this Dan and Shay – kind of corporatized version of what country music is now, that it just, kind of gets built in a boardroom and not built on the backs of what people in SEC country actually care about and like. And yeah, that's kind of one of the things I'm concerned about. But at this point, all that's left is just to simply hope that ends up not being true. Let's see. Joseph Kennedy says he thinks the pods, therefore, he says they are so NFL, and that is to an extent true because you have the 4-team divisions in college football. I'm sorry, in the NFL. So if the SEC were to go to the 4-team divisions, it'd seem a little bit more like the NFL. I'm also a little bit of an outlier when it comes to the SEC's divisions in that it is fairly common within most of the media who cares about this kind of thing to hear talk of doing away with the divisions, at least for the people who write about this stuff for a living. I don't know how average fans feel about it, but at least for the people who write about this stuff for a living, there are a lot of people who really want the SEC to do away with divisions so that you can rotate the schedule a little bit more frequently. I'm 100% against that, and I've talked about this plenty of times. Even Dan Mullen, we made this specific point last week. Dan Mullen, who was talking about wanting to do away with that and play other SEC West teams more frequently. I use the example of Florida LSU as a perfect example of this. That's a game that now means more because it has been played more frequently as opposed to these kind of one-off games where you never really develop any backstory with the team that you're playing. So from that standpoint, I like the long-standing tradition that's formed when you play the same teams year after year. I also think the SEC's divisions really mean something. I think the ACC and the Big Ten both initially got it wrong. The ACC didn't do geographic divisions. They did Atlantic and the Coastal. They wanted to split up what they thought would be, the dominance of Florida State, the dominance of Miami. They didn't want Florida State and Miami in the same division. It's hard to remember that now, but at the time when they expanded the ACC, the notion of Florida State and Miami being in the same division seemed like a real problem, 2 programs that had historically been powerful. So there was this convoluted effort to not make the ACC divisions geographically aligned. And what's funny is that Miami and Florida State have never really dominated the SEC, at least at the same time, or, in Miami's case, really ever. They haven't dominated the ACC the way at one point in time people thought they would. Sometimes things just kind of work out to be different than you assume they would. But the ACC's divisions have never meant anything because I'm someone who's obsessed with college football, but if you ask me who's in the ACC Coastal, they've had a million different winners. I think technically even Notre Dame may have won it last year. They've had a million different winners, and there's it's still hard to remember who all is in the division. The Atlantic's a little easier because that's Florida State and and Clemson. But the other division's impossible to keep track of. The divisions mean nothing. The Big Ten also, to a degree, is kind of the same way. At one point in time, they were the leaders and the legends, and then finally they went Big Ten East, Big Ten West. In most years, the Big Ten East is a really pretty good division, but I'd say the actual value, the worth of the division is still not quite what the SEC East and SEC West has been, because you've seen dominant teams coming out of both sides of the SEC. The Big Ten West has never quite had that. A couple more on Facebook, then we'll go over to YouTube. Miriam Martin Corbin on the subject of SEC money being watered down. I think the problem is that Oklahoma and Texas are just going to bring in so much money. That probably ends up not quite being true. Gerald Harmon says, when we were playing Madden on PS4 or Xbox was so simple. Pick your team, play Dynasty. Now when you play Madden, it's all this extra. He uses the very colorful emoji. That's where college football is heading. They're just doing too much. And I think that's probably kind of true. At least it feels that way to me. Steve Rogers says something I think is 100% true. He says, we, the fans, make the SEC what it is. No other conference comes close. Totally agree with that. You know, the whole idea of the SEC, it just means more. I would say there's an unspoken subtext that comes along with that. If the SEC just means more, it has to mean more in comparison to something else. And when you destroy the things that the SEC used to be compared to, all of a sudden there's nothing for you to compare yourself to determine whether or not you mean more than everything else, because all of a sudden there is nothing else. The SEC is kind of all that is. And so the thing that makes the SEC special, how much people love it by comparison to other conferences, that just doesn't quite exist anymore. And, you know, the notion of the league, it just means more, that just has a nice, much better ring to it than it's just worth more. The monetary value of the individual programs and the overall financial pie that the league, you know, contributes to, you know, the idea of the league having worth and meaning is just so much more important than the SEC having actual financial value, which is where all of this seems to be heading. And I'm really surprised at how common that opinion is. Really surprised by that. Jazz Hatcher on a different subject says, if Georgia doesn't win the SEC national championship this year while Alabama's reloading with so much, then it may never do so. I mean, this is an opportunity, right? At least it has the potential of being. There's a chance that Alabama does effectively reload just as well as it has in previous years. But it is not easy. New offensive coordinator, new quarterback, you know, leaning on new playmakers offensively. There's a lot to replace defensively, although, you know, you've got, you know, guys like Will Anderson who kind of man the linebacking core there. It's not an easy situation Alabama finds itself in, and it's not a rubber stamp to say they just reboot just as easily as ever. You're hoping to get a little bit of help from them, maybe on the come down just a bit, and you're hoping that Georgia's able to step up at exactly the right time. I think that's. I'm not going to join Jazz in saying it's never going to happen, but it does feel like an opportunity right now, and I won't deny that. Over here on the YouTube side of things. Scott Harris says the last coach we had with less class than Mullen was his defensive coordinator, Todd Grantham. Yeah, I was never a big Grantham fan at Georgia. I know that seems easy to say now, revisionist history, but you can go back and listen to me at the time. I was never a fan, really, of Todd Grantham. Johnny Lester asking, how did Texas and Oklahoma approach the SEC at the same time? What exactly happened behind the scenes? Who approached who? SEC lawyers, ESPN lawyers? That's the real story here. It remains a mystery. And, yeah, I think we're going to learn more about that. There's all kinds of reporting out there that a lot of this is being orchestrated by ESPN, who holds the TV contract now for all the SEC rights moving forward, who also holds the TV contract for the college football playoff. And this is, I think, an important part of all of this in terms of how you get to this point. The ESPN, one of the few entities they don't have full control over was the Big 12. That some Big 12 games are on the ESPN family of networks, but the biggest and best Big 12 games were on Fox. And so if you're ESPN and you look at the way in which streaming's changing things, to leave a big entity out there for somebody else to own only creates a streaming platform opportunity eventually for somebody else. Unfortunately, the entirety of the Big 12 is just not worth very much. I mean, I saw some reporting yesterday. There's a chance that the Big 12 schools, minus Oklahoma and Texas, might only generate $9 million a year in TV revenue. That is shockingly low. I believe the number for the most recent year is about $38 million. So you're talking about a huge downgrade in the financial worth of a TV contract for the Big 12. But ESPN potentially looks at this and says, it's not worth it to us to buy the entirety of the Big 12 contract, but if we can get Texas and Oklahoma to move to the SEC, we'll gladly pay the SEC more money to get what Texas and Oklahoma are probably worth here. And that's, kind of maybe how that's possibly generated. It's at least as reasonable an idea as maybe anything. As far as like the unity between Texas and Oklahoma, it seems like conference expansion always works better when it's done by even numbers, and so that's part of this. It's a weird scenario where Oklahoma on the field is way better than Texas, but in the boardroom, Texas has way more value than Oklahoma. So to a certain extent, Texas is almost doing Oklahoma a favor by allowing them to work together with all of this. Oklahoma clearly has value because they are such a fixture, in the college football playoff discussion every single year, and historically speaking, they're among the probably 4 or 5, most prolific programs of all time. National championships, Heisman Trophy winners, things like that. This is clearly a blue blood program, so that's kind of how they end up getting coupled together, and it's one of the reasons why, the other state school in the Big 12 from Texas right now, Texas Tech, doesn't get included. Oklahoma State, not really a partner here for Oklahoma because they just don't bring as much to the table. Very different than it was, like, say, in ACC expansion time when you actually had the University of Virginia working to help Virginia Tech get into the ACC. That was an example of two in-state schools working to help each other. Now it's a lot more every man for himself, or every person for himself, I guess. Jay Shipes weighing in on the Olympic controversy. I guess I'll leave that alone for right now. Let's see what else. Scott Harris says, can't wait to start having on-the-field conversations again. Yes, Scott, that's coming. Practice starting next week for sure. Let's see what else. Jordan Bowman on the subject of Andre Green. Yeah, I hate to be the one to say this, but it seems like the Andre Green Jr. to Georgia sort of feels like that's a dog that's not barking at the moment. I'm hopeful that I end up being wrong about that. But that sort of feels like we're a little quiet on the Andre Green front as of late. Maybe that ends up being different. I certainly hope it ends up being different. But it seems like we're a little quiet on that front here at the moment. Jay Bolton dropping the Chaz Chambliss fire comment. You love to see that. Cody Ledoux says, I'm sure Alabama will be perfectly fine whipping Texas and Oklahoma on a yearly basis. Maybe that's what happens, right? Maybe that's the case. But you got to remember something. As I said during the regular show, that most of the Texas, Oklahoma, and the SEC will be played out in a non-Nick Saban era. Now, maybe Alabama hires just as good a coach, but replacing a legend is not an easy thing to do. So, I think it's entirely possible that whoever the best program is in the 16-team SEC world, it ends up not being Alabama just because of, at a certain point in time, Father Time is undefeated. Chad Williams says, Bama fans feeling unbothered by the Texas and Oklahoma news. Wait till Saban's gone. Texas and Oklahoma recruiting at a different level from the TV exposure. Yeah, I mean, maybe, that's the case. Certainly there's great access to that Texas talent, but you're also going to have a lot of, schools going after that same, crop of Texas folks. And obviously Texas and Texas A&M will have kind of a home court advantage there. But, I could see this being a boost to Arkansas's recruiting because all of a sudden their pursuits in Texas have a little bit more relevance. Oklahoma's always going to try to recruit that state of Texas and has done so well. Don't forget about LSU here there as well. LSU's hour and a half drive to Houston. Am I right about that? Something along those lines. For as much as LSU likes dominating its in-state, LSU's tried to make a little inroads into Texas. So think about LSU as a potential factor for some Texas recruits going forward too. Not dominating the state or anything like that, but just a little bit of a factor in in-state recruiting. You've got a couple of examples of that. LSU's trying to get more into Texas. Arkansas is trying to get more into Louisiana. So you're going to see a little bit of moving pieces around some of that related to the SEC West. Yes.
Baton Rouge is 4 hours from Houston.
Okay, so New Orleans is certainly. I mean, 4 hours still. That's in your recruiting footprint, but New Orleans is right just down I-10 from New Orleans. But 4 hours is still very much within your recruiting footprint, much the same way Alabama has recruited, very well in Atlanta, about 3.5 hours away. Scott Harris says, doesn't Fox Sports stand to lose a lot of games? Yeah, I mean, as we said before, Scott, a big kind of unspoken part of this is the way in which ESPN is kind of getting over on Fox. And that's why, for the lawyers out there, words like tortious interference, I'm surprised we're not hearing a little bit more talk related to that, because I'm sure Fox actually probably likes the contract it currently has with the Big 12. And they will have the opportunity to downgrade that financial deal, and they will obviously probably do so. As we said before, you may see Big 12 teams only commanding, $9-10 million, something along those lines. But what Fox would rather have is just compelling programming, and the loss of Texas and Oklahoma will take a lot of that away. Paul Anthony Baseball says, I heard talk that Auburn and Bama could be shifted to the SECs at some point once Texas and Oklahoma get here. And, that's as much of a possibility as anything, right? And, it could be that it's just simpler to kind of keep divisions in play. Maybe that's what they choose to do. Like, I don't have a huge problem with Alabama and Auburn being in the SEC East. For one thing, for someone like me who does like preserving whatever traditions you can, not only continuing to play the Iron Bowl every single year, but continuing to allow Georgia to play Auburn every single year, Alabama to play Tennessee every single year. If that's the case, then I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I would say as someone who's, in my early 40s, when you look at the entirety of my lifetime, and really even predating my lifetime, I mean, Georgia and Alabama just haven't played enough. Herschel Walker never played against Alabama. There are, a lot of eras for Georgia football that just haven't included games against Alabama, and I'd like to see that change. I wouldn't mind seeing Georgia and Alabama playing a lot more frequently. If they played every single year, I mean, yeah, it's a tough game, but I mean, you got to play somebody. Why not play, a good measuring stick game, and why not let Georgia Alabama become a little bit more of a true rivalry by playing it every single year? I'm certainly not going to run away from that if I'm Georgia. I mean, it's a new league, right? I mean, you're going to play some pretty tough teams, and so, I mean, if you told me I could play Alabama every single year, or I could play, like, say, Oklahoma every single year, I believe I might choose Alabama on that, regardless of who the better team is. Just preserving some sort of geographic component to all of this. Arkansas, Texas A&M, and who's the other one? Oklahoma. They ought to be playing each other all the time. Those teams should be playing each other every single year. And Georgia ought to, I think, probably be playing the SEC teams that are also closer to it. And, if you want to make, the entirety of the SEC recent history, there was a time in which the balance favored the East. There was a time in which the balance has favored the West. And over the course of the next few decades, it'll swing back and forth in both ways there as well. Oklahoma has had, a down run 25 years ago. Alabama had a down run, for a brief period of time there as well. Georgia's going to have its ups and downs. You're going to have those little blips on the radar one way or another. But over the course of time, it probably evens itself out. Let's see what else. One or two more trips around the sun here will be gone. Let me go back over to Facebook for a moment. We'll get a couple more comments. Paul Baker says, if Alabama moves to the East, will Texas A&M be the beast of the West? I mean, even in a new look SEC, I still think that A&M is well positioned in all of this. I do. I mean, if you told me right now I could have Jimbo, Lincoln Riley, Steve Sarkisian, I'll still cast my lot with Jimbo in comparison to those coaches. Jimbo Fisher's won a national championship that means something to me. Lincoln Riley's a good coach, certainly an offensive mastermind, but as an architect of a program, I'll take Jimbo over Lincoln Riley. So if you're looking for, potential, early years dominant program in the SEC West, no reason, if it's the way that you just described it, no reason it couldn't be Texas A&M there. Epic Robinson with his traditional Bill Bender tweet. What's next for college football? Joel Moody asked. The winners of the fantasy football leagues get to set the schedules for their favorite teams. Yeah, I mean, obviously, anything is possible, right? We're going to have a lot of changes coming in the years to come. It certainly seems like. Jermaine King says so much has happened that I forgot all this transfer portal stuff, and that's kind of interesting. And I still think, I'd still say that if you had Kirby Smart sitting at this desk with me right now, and you talked about all the changes coming to college football for Smart and the other big-time coaches, adapting to the transfer portal, I still think it's the biggest one they deal with. Completely new look conference, name, image, likeness. I think the impact of name, image, likeness, I believe, pales in comparison to the challenges they have when it comes to the transfer portal. Even through all of this, I still think that's probably the biggest threat to the quality of life of a coach, is knowing that the guys you have, you got to recruit them just to keep them, that they're actually being recruited off your roster. I think that stands as a pretty big challenge for coaches. Philip Jordan Wells says that Bama is actually down longer than a brief period of time, which is true. You think about the Gene Stallings team in '93 up until when they finally, emerged as, good under Nick Saban in 2008. That's a little bit longer span of time than I gave it credit for. That is certainly true. Tim Tatum says Oklahoma and Texas will benefit greatly in recruiting from this move. Maybe so, but for the most part, they were already getting the 4-star prospects in that region anyway. That's the other thing that's kind of amazing here is, by any way you slice it, the Big 12 was just lucky to have them. And I know you talk about, like lack of parity because they were getting extra shares and things like that. The Big 12 was truly just lucky to have Texas and Oklahoma because the rest of those programs are barely a blip on the radar in comparison to them. There are almost no elite recruits being signed, at least not in any significant numbers, by any of the non-Oklahoma, Texas, Big 12 schools. So, for the most part, it's not like there were elite recruits being spread across the Big 12 that will now more greatly consider Texas and Oklahoma. Texas and Oklahoma, for the most part, kind of getting those folks anyway. So, Oklahoma recruiting had a little bit of a brief dip in the early stages of the Lincoln Riley era, but they've actually kind of bounced back, and they're recruiting in a pretty high-level fashion right now. You can say what you will about Texas and not cultivating this talent, but truth is Texas is still recruiting probably just fine there too. So it could be they get a recruiting bump throughout all of this, but for the most part, Texas and Oklahoma were getting the unfair share of recruits that you would expect two resource programs to already be getting as it was. Last comments, and we're going to bounce out of here. Green Soldier says, why aren't people pushing that narrative? Texas is already a top 10, 15 talented team. By joining the SEC, I don't see much of anything change. It opens the door both ways. Bama pulls more. There will definitely be more eyeballs on SEC teams in the state of Texas already. A lot of the top programs have become so national in scope. Alabama's recruited very well nationally. The 4-star linebacker they got this week was from Virginia. Obviously, Georgia's done plenty of that. The very best teams who can throw budget out the window, they can travel as much as they want, they can host visitors as much as they want, they're already money whipping their competition so much that, if you expect to see these 16 SEC teams, or at least the 10 or 12 of these SEC teams that really have the most cachet, we're already heading for a world in which they dominate everything anyway. I'll say it like this. I don't think the presence of this elite version of the SEC is going to make those other programs recruit more dominant fashion. I think the reason why we're having an elite SEC is because those programs have already cornered the market on all the recruits anyway. That it's not, hey, this SEC is going to create great recruiting programs. It's these great recruiting programs who have now made it almost a necessity that you kind of partition them off into their own league. And that's why eventually you may see other non-Southern teams, join in on all this, because they're, at most a couple of dozen teams who collect, and really probably even less than that, dozen and a half programs that collect all of the elite recruits, and almost none go anywhere else ever. And eventually that may be all the folks who are here. And Green Soldier, good comment there for sure. All right, let's get ready to bounce. Good stuff all the way around there. By the way, Brady Pass Management has an interesting point about, if Alabama does beat up on Florida bad early in the season, the kind of narrative that can form around that. That'll be interesting to watch there for sure. All right, good stuff. Make sure you check out the Atlanta Journal-Constitution online, ajc.com. There's fun stuff. Big game tonight for the Braves. 2 of 3 they've taken thus far in their series against the New York Mets. Tonight, to have been able to take, 3 of 4 here, with some interesting stuff looming after that, this is a very, very pivotal stretch. If the Braves have any chance of being buyers of the trade deadline, how they continue to perform here in New York and kind of what happens after that, critical. So we'll see tonight if they can really make this a step forward by taking 3 or 4 from the Mets there. We'll pay close attention to all of that. And also on a more serious front, obviously, sentencing on the heels of what happened in Cherokee County with the horrible shooting and the news as it continues to unfold related to that. Obviously, it's important to stay up to date on what's happening in the world, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution gives you a chance to do that online at ajc.com. Also, all the latest coronavirus stuff and everything else, which it's also important to stay notified about. You can check out all that online, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, ajc.com. Big thanks to R.S. Andrews for making the R.S. Andrews Cool Down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all that for you. They show up on time, do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. Find them online today at rsandrews.com. Thank you for being here for DawgNation Daily, presented by Harrah's Cherokee Casino Resort. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.
For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.